The revolving door spat them into the lobby like an apology no one wanted to hear. Rain streamed off a cheap canvas duffel. A small girl's sneakers squeaked across white marble, and the stuffed rabbit slipped from her fingers, landing soft and soaked at her father's heel. Heads turned. A woman at the bar lowered her wine glass. A man in a tailored suit smirked into his date's shoulder. Behind the front desk, the manager named Allison Brooks did not touch her keyboard. She did not check the system. She simply looked at the man in the rumpled coat at the 8-year-old, clutching his hand, and reached for the phone to call security. 20 minutes. That was all it took for the quiet man with the wet duffel to learn every name in that lobby, and for every name in that lobby to learn his. The man with the wet duffel had a name, though no one in the lobby had bothered to ask for it. Michael Carter was 42 years old, and he had spent the last 11 of those years building a hospitality company that nobody at the Crown Meridian Chicago had heard of by its proper name. Carter Holdings was the shell that signed the checks. The board called it the parent. The lawyers called it the acquirer. 2 weeks earlier, in a glass conference room in Manhattan, that shell had quietly absorbed every Crown Meridian property in the United States, 47 of them, from the flagship in Chicago to a boutique on the Pacific Coast Highway, for $2.3 billion. Michael had signed the final page with his mother's fountain pen. She had been a housekeeper at the Belford Grand in Detroit for 23 years. She had pressed sheets and folded towel swans and learned the names of every guest's children. And on a Tuesday in 1991, a manager named Mr. Halloran had walked her out of the staff entrance for failing to project the appropriate image when she'd accidentally addressed a senator's wife by the wrong title. She had cried in the car for 40 minutes before driving home to make Michael's dinner. He had been 9 years old. He had never forgotten the sound of her trying to swallow the crying so he wouldn't hear it through the apartment wall. He did not trust internal reports. He did not trust corporate audits. He trusted the test of a tired traveler with a child and a cheap bag, because that was the only test that had ever told the truth. That was why he had not changed his clothes after the flight. That was why the duffel was the duffel he had owned in graduate school. That was why tonight, in a lobby of polished marble and gold sconces and an enormous orchid arrangement that probably cost more than his mother's first car. He had walked in, looking exactly like the kind of guest a place like this had been quietly trained to refuse. Sophie pressed close against his leg. She was 8 with her mother's serious dark eyes and her father's slow considering way of looking at the world. She had been awake for 14 hours. The flight from New York had been delayed 4 times on the runway at LaGuardia, and somewhere over Pennsylvania, she had spilled apple juice down the front of her sweater. And now the sweater was tacky, and the rabbit her mother had given her was tucked under her arm, with one ear bent backward from being slept on. Her mother. Elena. 2 years gone this March. Pancreatic cancer diagnosed in October gone by Easter. Sophie still talked to her sometimes in the car when she thought Michael wasn't listening. "Daddy?" Sophie said very quietly. "I think I dropped Mr. Buttons." Michael bent and picked up the rabbit. It had landed in a small puddle of rainwater pooling at the edge of the entry mat. He wiped it on his coat and handed it back to her. She took it solemnly the way she took everything since her mother had died and tucked it back under her chin. The woman behind the front desk had not moved. Her name was Allison Brooks, and she had been the general manager of the Crown Meridian Chicago for 5 years. She was 38, with the kind of sleek, considered appearance that took 2 hours and a lot of money every morning, and a voice trained at hospitality school in Switzerland to land somewhere precisely between warmth and steel. She knew the way the staff at every Crown Meridian was supposed to know that a guest was a brand decision before they were a person. That principle had a name in the back-of-house training manual. They called it guest profile alignment. She had learned it from a man named Robert Hadley, who had been general manager here before her and who had pulled her aside during her first year with a story about a family in matching tracksuits who had checked into a corner suite in 2016 and burned a hole through a hand-loomed Persian rug worth $86,000. The rug had not been insured for full replacement. The family had not been wealthy. The lawsuit had gone nowhere. There's a kind of guest, Hadley had told her, swirling bourbon in a heavy crystal glass at the end of a long shift, who belongs at a Crown Meridian. And there's a kind of guest who thinks they do. Your job, Allison, is to know the difference before they reach the elevator. She had told herself for 5 years that this was not about money. It was not about clothes. It was not about race. It was about fit. The Crown Meridian was a brand built across 8 decades, and her job was to protect it. So when she looked up from her station and saw the man in the rumpled coat with the cheap duffel and the wet shoes, and the child whose sweater had a stain across the chest, she did not feel cruelty. She felt clarity. She offered him a smile that did not reach her eyes. "Good evening, sir. May I help you find your way?" "Checking in," Michael said. "Reservation under Carter Holdings." Allison did not type. She did not glance at her monitor. She tilted her head with the precise degree of polite regret she had practiced in the mirror as a hostess at 23. "I'm so sorry. I'm not seeing anything under that name. Are you perhaps thinking of the Holiday Inn? It's just 3 blocks east. They have a lovely family rate this time of year." Michael felt the corner of his jaw tighten. He kept his voice level. "It's a suite. Booked 2 weeks ago. Could you check the system, please?" "Sir." Allison said gentler now, the way one is gentle with someone who has misunderstood a menu. "I've been at this desk for the last 6 hours. I would know about a suite booking. Could it be under a different platform? Sometimes the third-party sites are unreliable." Behind him, Michael could hear the lobby beginning to listen. At the long mahogany bar that ran along the eastern wall, a woman in her early 60s had set down her glass of Pinot Noir. Her name was Eleanor Whitmore. Her husband was the chief of cardiothoracic surgery at Northwestern, and she had been coming to the Crown Meridian on the 3rd Friday of every month for 19 years for what she and her husband privately called their standing date. She watched the exchange at the desk with the still attention of a woman who had grown up in Birmingham, Alabama in the 1960s, and who had been taught very early what it looked like when someone was being measured by something other than their actual self. "Allison, dear," she called with the easy authority of a long-tenured guest. "Why don't you just run it through one more time?" Allison's smile widened by a calibrated half-millimeter. "I've already handled it, Mrs. Whitmore. Thank you." Eleanor did not smile back. She glanced at her husband, who put one warm hand over hers on the bar top, the way he had been doing for 41 years when he wanted her to keep her seat. She kept her seat. She did not look away. Closer to the lobby fireplace, a younger man in a navy suit, cut a little too sharply at the shoulders, had stopped pretending to scroll on his phone. His name was Daniel Thornton. He was 29, 3 years into a vice presidency at a midtown investment bank, and the woman beside him was a junior associate. He was 3 dates into trying to impress. He leaned toward her, his mouth pulled into the small private smirk of a man who has located the evening's entertainment. "Somebody," he murmured, "really thinks Crown Meridian is a Motel 6. She giggled. The sound was small, but it carried. Michael heard it. He did not turn around. Sophie, who heard everything, looked up at her father, with a question forming on her face, and he squeezed her hand once and shook his head very slightly. "Not now. Not here, sir." Allison's tone had shifted the gentleness, sharpening into something close to a warning. "I have other guests. If you don't have a confirmed reservation, I'm going to have to ask you to step aside." "I have a confirmed reservation." "Then you have it somewhere else. This is a Crown Meridian property. We have standards to maintain." There it was. Standards. Michael had a phone in his right coat pocket. One press of the home screen, one call to David Lane, his chief of staff, and the man who had personally walked the acquisition paperwork through escrow, and this entire scene could end in the time it would take Allison to refill her water glass. Carter Holdings could light up her monitor with a confirmation that would have her stammering apologies for the next 10 years. He almost did it. He almost did it because Sophie was tired, and Sophie was 8, and Sophie's mother was dead, and a child whose mother was dead should not be standing on cold marble at 9:43 at night, being told by a stranger that she did not belong in a building. But then he thought of the 46 other Crown Meridian lobbies. He thought of the other Sophies. He thought of his own mother in the parking lot of the Belford Grand, swallowing her crying. He thought of how many Allison Brookses there were inside a chain this big, and how many of them had been trained by how many Robert Hadleys, and how the only way to know was to let it run. One night, he told himself. One look at the bottom of it. He took his hand off the phone. Allison had already lifted the house receiver. Her voice was clipped and bright. "Security to the front desk, please." 2 men in dark blazers came across the lobby, with the unhurried walk of men who had done this before. The taller one a name tag that said, "Brent gave Michael a once-over," that was not unkind, but was not undecided. "Sir, we're going to need you to step outside." Sophie's hand tightened in his. "Daddy." Michael crouched. He set the duffel down. He smoothed the damp hair back from her forehead with the side of his thumb, the way he had every night since Elena had died, and he kept his voice as steady as he had ever kept it for anything. "It's okay, baby. We're just going to step outside for a minute. Hold Mr. Buttons tight." She nodded. She held the rabbit. Eleanor Whitmore half rose from her bar stool. Her husband's hand closed firmly over hers. "Eleanor," he said quietly, "don't make a scene." She sat back down. She would not forgive herself for it. Not that night, and not for a long time after. Daniel Thornton lifted his phone and very casually began to record. Michael picked up the duffel. He picked up his daughter's hand, and he walked his 8-year-old out of the lobby of the hotel he owned into the rain. The rain had not gotten any softer. Michael stood with Sophie under the brass-edged overhang at the front of the Crown Meridian, watching water sheet down off the awning in a curtain that turned the street beyond into a smear of red brake lights and yellow cabs. He had set the duffel against the wall behind them out of the runoff, and he had taken off his coat and draped it around his daughter's shoulders. The coat was too big for her by half. She looked standing there in it, like a child playing dress-up in her father's closet. She did not look up at him for a long time. When she finally did, her voice was so small, he almost missed it under the sound of the falling water. "Daddy, did we do something wrong?" It was the way she asked it. Not angry, not crying, just genuinely trying to understand that cracked something open in Michael's chest. He went down on one knee in front of her on the wet concrete and put his hands very gently on her shoulders. "No, baby. We didn't do anything. They did." She thought about that. She was 8, and she was learning in real time that grown-ups could be wrong in a way that did not get corrected, and her face was working through it the way her face worked through fractions at the kitchen table. Then she lifted her dark, serious eyes to his. "Daddy," she said, "why didn't you just tell them who you are?" The world stopped for a second around Michael Carter. He had asked himself a version of that question every 2 minutes since they had walked through the revolving door. He had answered himself with strategy, and with principle, and with his mother's name, and he had felt the entire time like a man making good arguments to drown out something quieter that was trying to tell him the truth. His daughter had just said the quiet thing out loud. He had used her. He had used his 8-year-old daughter, whose mother had been buried 2 years and 1 month ago, as a stress test for a corporate culture. He had let strangers humiliate her on cold marble so that he could see with his own eyes what was rotten inside a building he had bought. He had told himself it was for the next Sophie, but the present Sophie was right here in his coat, and she was the one paying the bill. He could not give her an answer that would survive being said out loud, so he gave her the only honest one he had. Because Daddy was trying to be smart, sweetheart, and sometimes When Daddy tries to be smart, he forgets to be a good dad first. She studied him. She did not entirely accept it, but she nodded once the way Elena used to nod when she had decided to file something away and come back to it later. He pulled out his phone. David Lane picked up on the first ring. He always picked up on the first ring. He had picked up on the first ring during his own honeymoon in Santorini in 2022, and Michael had once tried to fire him for it and failed. "Tell me," David said. Michael told him. He told him in the spare, exact sentences of a man who had been an executive for too long to waste words, even when he wanted to throw something. He told him about Allison Brooks. He told him about the security walk. He told him about Sophie standing in his coat under the awning. The line was quiet on the other end for what felt like a long time. "Michael," David said finally, and his voice was careful. "You don't need to do this tonight. Go to the peninsula. I'll have a suite ready in 20 minutes. Let me put a corporate response team on the ground at 6 a.m. We'll handle Brooks the right way. The legal way. The clean way. Take Sophie upstairs and order her room service pancakes, and let me do my job." It was good advice. It was the advice Michael paid him $750,000 a year to give. Sophie tugged on the bottom of his sweater. "Daddy," she said, "can we just go home?" He looked down at her. He had not noticed until that moment that she was shivering. He almost said yes. Inside the lobby, behind the curve of the front desk, a young man named Caleb Rivera was about to make a decision that would change the shape of his next 10 years. He had been a night shift front desk associate at the Crown Meridian for 6 months and 3 weeks. He was 24. He had a degree in hotel and restaurant management from a state school in southern Illinois, a younger sister still in high school, and a mother who had been diagnosed with type 2 diabetes the summer he graduated, and who needed her insulin and her testing strips, and the rent on the 2-bedroom in Pilsen paid on time every month, which Caleb did, by working this front desk and not asking questions that Allison Brooks did not want asked. He had watched the whole thing from the back of the desk, where he had been pretending to organize key envelopes. He had watched Allison not type. He had watched her not look. He had watched a child be walked out of his lobby by Brent from security, and he had felt something cold and ugly turn over in his stomach, and he had said nothing. He had a very clear memory suddenly of his mother at the kitchen table in their old apartment when he had been about Sophie's age. She had been telling him a story about a co-worker at the meatpacking plant who had been blamed for something he had not done, and Caleb had asked why no one had stood up for the man, and his mother had set down her coffee cup and looked at him across the Formica and said in the voice she only used when she meant it, "Mijo, if you see something wrong and you do nothing, you become part of the wrong. There is no neutral." He had been carrying that sentence around for 16 years. Allison stepped away from the desk to escort a regular guest over to the bar, smiling her practiced smile. Her back turned to the terminals for the first time all evening. Brent and the other security officer were back at their post by the elevator bank. The lobby had reset itself the way lobbies do the small disturbance of a man and a child, smoothed back into the murmur of money and weather. Caleb pulled up the reservation system. He typed Carter Holdings. He did not expect anything. He expected the screen to show him nothing, and then he was going to be able to walk out into the street on his break, and at least tell the man he was sorry, and maybe slip him a list of 3 decent hotels within 4 blocks, and live with himself. The screen did not show him nothing. The screen showed him the presidential suite, 32nd floor, booked for 7 nights, 2 adults, 1 child. Special amenities tagged, child welcome package, hypoallergenic bedding kitchenette stocked for an 8-year-old. And in the upper right corner of the reservation, in a small red field, he had only ever seen twice before a flag he had been told about exactly once during onboarding, and told to call a manager if he ever saw it. Tier 1, confidential owner. Level access, do not disclose to staff. Caleb felt the blood leave his face. He opened a second window. He typed Michael Carter, Carter Hospitality Group into the browser. The first result was a Forbes profile from 11 months earlier. The photograph at the top of the article was a man in his early 40s, in a charcoal suit, standing in front of a glass wall in a high-rise office. The same line of the jaw. The same way of looking at the camera, like he was deciding whether to trust it. The headline read, "Carter Hospitality to acquire Crown Meridian. In $2.3 billion deal, closing expected late spring." Caleb stood there with his hand on the mouse, and through the rain-smeared glass of the front entrance, he could see the silhouette of the man he had just walked out of his own lobby, still on the phone, still under the awning, with his daughter pressed against his leg. He did not call Allison over. He did not ask anyone what to do. He picked up the front desk phone and dialed housekeeping and told them to send a cart of fresh towels, a dry, child-sized robe in a size 8, and a pot of hot chocolate to the presidential suite immediately. Then he walked around the front of the desk and out toward the revolving door. Outside, Sophie was tugging on her father's hand again, and her voice had taken on a different shape, the slightly thinner shape that meant she was getting close to crying and trying very hard not to. "Daddy, I don't like this place. I want to go home. I miss Mommy." The word Mommy hit Michael in the soft place under the sternum where Elena still lived. He went down on one knee for the second time in 5 minutes, the concrete soaked through his slacks. "Honey, listen to me." She listened. "Daddy needs to fix something inside that building first. Not for us. We don't have to come back here ever after tonight if you don't want to. But there are other kids, baby, other kids, your age who might walk in here tomorrow night or next week. And if Daddy doesn't fix it tonight, those kids are going to feel exactly the way you just felt. Can you give me 20 minutes? Just 20. And then we go upstairs and there's a real bed, and tomorrow morning we get on a plane home." "Okay." She studied him with Elena's eyes. 20 minutes, she said. 20 minutes. I promise. She nodded. The revolving door behind them sighed, and Caleb Rivera stepped out under the awning. He was a tall, slim young man with close-cropped dark hair and the careful posture of someone who had been told all his life to stand up straight. He stopped about 6 feet from Michael, and Michael could see, even in the bad light, that his hands were shaking. "Mr. Carter," Michael straightened up slowly. "Sir, I just verified your reservation in our system. The presidential suite has been ready for you since 4 o'clock this afternoon. I want to apologize on behalf of this property for the misunderstanding at the desk. If you and your daughter would come back inside, I would like to walk you up personally." Michael looked at him for a long, even moment. "What's your name?" "Caleb Rivera, sir. Front desk associate." "How long have you worked here, Caleb?" 6 months, sir, and 3 weeks. "And do you know," Michael said very quietly, "what's likely to happen to you if you walk us back through that door right now in front of your manager?" Caleb's jaw worked once. "Yes, sir. I have a pretty good idea." "And you're doing it anyway?" "Yes, sir." Michael held out his hand. Caleb took it. The handshake was firm on both ends and lasted about a second longer than it needed to. "Lead the way, Mr. Rivera." They walked back through the revolving door together, Michael carrying the duffel, Sophie clutching the rabbit, Caleb a half step ahead, his back very straight, like a man walking toward something he had decided not to look away from. The lobby was not the same lobby they had left. It had gone quiet in the way rooms go quiet when something has happened that no one quite knows how to name yet. Eleanor Whitmore was still at the bar, but she was no longer pretending not to watch. Daniel Thornton's phone was still out, but he had stopped recording, and the smirk had slipped off his face like makeup running in heat. 2 new guests had drifted in from the street and were standing near the concierge desk without checking in, sensing the way people sense weather, that something was about to break. Allison Brooks looked up from her station, and her smile lasted exactly half a second before it failed. She crossed the floor toward them on heels she had been wearing for 9 hours. "Caleb, I'll take it from here. Whatever you think you found, you're mistaken." "Ms. Brooks, the reservation is—" "I said I'll take it from here." Michael did not raise his voice. "Caleb, Please pull the reservation up on the main lobby display. Behind the front desk, mounted above the floral arrangement, was a 60-inch screen that normally showed a slow cycling reel of the property's spa offerings and seasonal menus. Caleb walked around the desk, mirrored his terminal to it, and the spa photographs blinked out and were replaced in clean, white-on-black corporate type by a reservation record. Guest Carter, Michael J., and dependent. Suite Presidential Floor, 32. Booking Entity Carter. Holdings LLC. Access. Tier Owner Level Confidential. The lobby went very precisely silent. Allison's voice, when it came, had thinned. That has to be a system error. Anyone can put any name into a... Michael lifted his phone and tapped twice. The video call connected on the first ring the way they always did. He turned the phone outward, so the screen was visible to the whole lobby, and the faces of 7 members of the Carter Hospitality Group Board of Directors filled the small, bright rectangle. They were in a conference room in Midtown Manhattan, where it was 10:46 p.m., and they had clearly been waiting. The woman at the head of the table, Margaret Ellsworth, chair of the board, a former federal judge whose face had been on the cover of 2 business magazines that year, spoke first. "Good evening, Mr. Carter. We're standing by." "Madam Chair, I'm at the Crown Meridian, Chicago. Could you confirm for the record and for the staff, present my current relationship to this property?" Mr. Carter is the founder, chairman, and majority shareholder of Carter Hospitality Group, which closed its acquisition of Crown Meridian Hotels and Resorts on April 11th of this year. Every Crown Meridian property in the United States, including the Chicago flagship in which Mr. Carter is presently standing, is wholly owned by Carter Holdings as of that date. Across the lobby, somebody Michael did not see, who let out a breath that sounded like a small, involuntary curse word. Daniel Thornton picked up his date's coat off the back of her chair without sitting back down and started walking very quickly and without looking at anyone toward the elevator bank. His date hesitated, then followed her cheeks the color of the wine she had been laughing over 20 minutes earlier. Eleanor Whitmore set her glass down very carefully on the bar and let her eyes find Allison Brooks across the marble. She did not say anything. She did not need to. Michael lowered the phone. "Allison." She did not answer him. She was looking at the screen above the desk, at her own slow ruin spelled out in white letters, and her face was working through something Michael had seen on the faces of executives across a conference table when a deal they had spent 2 years on collapsed in a single afternoon. It was not shame exactly. It was the more terrible thing that comes before shame. When a person begins to understand that the story they have been telling themselves about who they are may not be the story anyone else has been reading. "Allison," Michael said again, and his voice was not unkind. "Why didn't you check the system?" For a long moment she did not answer. When she did not cry. She did not apologize. She did something stranger, and in its way more honest. She told him the truth as she had been taught to understand it. "Sir, I have been managing this property for 5 years. I know what kind of guest belongs at a Crown Meridian. I was protecting the brand." "Who taught you to know?" She blinked. "I'm sorry." "Who taught you to know what kind of guest belongs? Give me the name." Allison's mouth opened and closed once. Then she said almost mechanically, like a student called on for a recitation she had practiced for years. "Mr. Hadley, Robert Hadley. He was the general manager here before me. He trained me personally. And Mr. Caldwell at the Boston property. And Miss Renton at the Denver property. We were all trained on the same standards." Michael closed his eyes for half a second. The rot was not one woman. He had suspected. Now he knew. He opened his eyes. He did not let his face show what he had just understood. Instead, he turned slowly and looked down at his daughter, who had been standing this entire time, with her father's coat dragging on the marble around her ankles and her rabbit clutched up under her chin. Sophie tugged on his sleeve. The lobby, which had been quiet, became something past quiet. "Daddy," she said, in a voice that was not particularly loud, and that did not need to be. Why were they so mean to us? It traveled across the marble the way only a child's question can travel across a room full of adults who have been hiding from themselves. Eleanor Whitmore's hand came up to her mouth. The young woman at the concierge desk lowered her eyes and did not lift them. Brent from security, standing at the elevators, looked at the floor. Allison Brooks looked at the child. For the first time, something in her face cracked. Not all the way, just a hairline. But it was there. She was looking at an 8-year-old in a wet sweater holding a stuffed rabbit, and whatever the back-of-house manual called this child brand misalignment guest profile, concern, image, risk. None of those words were standing up under the actual weight of the actual girl in front of her. Michael crouched down to Sophie's level. He did not lower his voice. He let the whole lobby hear him. "I don't know, sweetheart. I don't know why, but I promise you, I am going to make sure it doesn't happen to another kid like you. Not in this hotel. Not in any hotel with my name on it." "Okay." She nodded against his shoulder. He stood up. He turned to Caleb. "Pull the internal complaint records for this property. The last 18 months. Mirror them to the lobby screen." Caleb did not ask if he was sure. Caleb typed. What appeared on the screen above the desk, scrolling slowly so the entire room could read it, was not one complaint. It was 23. 18 months of guests refused at check-in for reasons coded in language that lined up like this did not pretend anymore. Guest presentation inconsistent with property standards. Family appeared to be in transit. Guest declined to provide alternative card despite confirmed reservation. Concerns regarding minor child noise levels prior to room assignment, and then threaded through the complaints the staff side. 3 separate write-ups of housekeepers and bellhops who had filed internal grievances against Allison Brooks for instructing them to misreport incidents. All 3 grievances marked in the system, resolved no action. A woman in a housekeeping uniform had stepped out from a service hallway and was standing now at the edge of the lobby. Her name tag said, Mariah. She was older, maybe 50, and her hands were folded in front of her, the way hands fold, when a person has spent a lifetime being told to make themselves small. She cleared her throat. "I filed one of those," she said. Her voice carried farther than she expected it to, and she flinched at her own volume, and then she did not back down. 2 years ago. A family. 3 kids. They had a reservation. Ms. Brooks told me to write that they had been drunk and disorderly. They had not been drunk. They had been tired. Behind her, a younger man in a bellhop's uniform stepped forward. His name was Jamal Foster. He had been at the property 4 years. I filed one too. A man in a wheelchair. November of last year. She told me to log him as a transient guest concern. He wasn't transient. He was a guest at our own wedding block. From the corridor that led to the restaurant, a waitress in a black apron, Anna Beckett, 3 years in the dining room, added her name to the list out loud. And then there were 4 of them, standing in a loose, uneven line at the edge of the marble, and the air in the lobby had changed shape entirely. Allison Brooks did not move. She was watching the screen above the desk. She was watching her own name scroll past on it, again and again and again. Michael had been about to speak. Sophie broke. It happened fast the way breaking happens in 8-year-olds who have held themselves together past their limit. The phones that had reappeared around the lobby, the flashes from people recording the voices of strangers, naming things she did not understand. The 4-hour delay, and the spilled juice, and the rabbit her mother had given her, wet through to the stuffing. It all caught up to her, at once. She tugged on her father's hand hard, and her face was wet, and her shoulders were shaking, and her voice came out high and ragged, and pulled directly from somewhere underneath 2 years of careful management, of a grief no 8-year-old should have had to manage in the first place. "Daddy, please, can we go? I want Mommy. I want Mommy back." Michael Carter stopped breathing. The lobby, which had been about to applaud something, stopped along with him, He looked down at his daughter, at her tear-streaked face, at her hair plastered to her forehead, at the rabbit her mother had bought at a hospital gift shop 16 days before she died, now hanging by one ear from her small fist, soaked through. And he understood, with the clean and terrible clarity that only comes a few times in a man's life, that he had won the argument and lost the only thing that mattered. He had been right about the hotel. He had been wrong about everything else. He bent and picked her up. She was almost too big to be carried now, all elbows and long legs, but she folded into his shoulder the way she had at 5, the way she had the night Elena died. And he held the back of her head with his whole hand, the way Elena used to, and he pressed his face into her hair, and he said low enough that only she could hear it, and only she ever would. "I'm sorry, baby. I'm sorry. Daddy was wrong tonight. Daddy was so wrong." He carried her toward the elevators. He turned his head once before the doors closed and met Caleb Rivera's eyes across the lobby. "Take care of the rest," he said. "I'll handle the formal announcement in the morning." Caleb nodded. The elevator door slid shut. In the lobby, Eleanor Whitmore stood up from her bar stool. She did not look at her husband, who did not this time reach for her hand. She walked across the marble in her low heels, past Allison Brooks, who had not moved, and stopped in front of the front desk, where a 24-year-old front desk associate was standing very straight and trying not to shake. "Young man," she said, "what is your name?" "Caleb Rivera, ma'am. Caleb Rivera," she repeated like she was filing it somewhere she would not forget. "I have been a guest at this hotel for 19 years. I would like you to know that what you did tonight is the first thing this building has done in a very long time that I am not ashamed of." She did not wait for him to answer. She walked back to her husband at the bar. She picked up her wine glass. She set it down again untouched and asked the bartender very quietly to pour it out. Outside, the weather had not changed. Upstairs, the presidential suite smelled of fresh towels and hot chocolate. Housekeeping had come and gone before they arrived. A dry robe in Sophie's size lay folded on the bed. The pot of cocoa Caleb had ordered was waiting on the kitchenette counter with 2 mugs, one of them deliberately childproof. Michael ran a warm bath for Sophie at 11:15, and she sat in it without talking. And when he wrapped her in the robe afterward, she fell asleep against his shoulder before he had finished combing out her hair. He laid her down on the king-sized bed in the second bedroom and pulled the duvet up to her chin and sat on the edge of the mattress with one hand on her back, the way Elena used to, waiting out the small shudders that kept moving through her every few minutes, even after she had stopped crying. He did not move until almost 2 in the morning. When he came out into the main room of the suite, David Lane had arrived. David had let himself in with the master keycard Caleb had pressed into his hand at the elevator. He was sitting in the chair by the window with his laptop balanced on his knees and a cup of coffee at his elbow, and he did not say anything when Michael came in. He simply nodded once and got up and made a fresh pot of coffee, and the two of them sat in the quiet of a 32nd floor suite at 2 in the morning and did not talk about what had happened in the lobby. By 6:15 the next morning, the video had been viewed 11 million times. David had not slept. He sat in the same chair by the window with the same laptop balanced on his knees and a fresh cup of cold coffee at his elbow, watching the counter climb on a TikTok account belonging to a woman who had been sitting 3 bar stools down from Eleanor Whitmore. The night before, one of several guests who had recorded the scene before Daniel Thornton had thought better of his own footage and put his phone away. The hashtag underneath read, #Crown Meridian Shame, and it had been trending at number 2 on the platform since 4 a.m., behind only an earthquake in Peru. The clip ran 47 seconds. It showed a man in a wet coat being walked toward a revolving door by 2 security officers, while an 8-year-old girl held onto his hand and tried to keep up with his stride. The major outlets had picked it up at 5. CNN had run it at the bottom of the hour. The New York Times had a digital story up by 5:40. The Washington Post had reached out for comment 3 times in the last 40 minutes. David had been silencing his phone in 5-minute increments since dawn. He could hear through the door of the second bedroom the soft, regular breathing of an 8-year-old still asleep. Michael came out of the bedroom at 6:20 in last night's slacks and a clean white shirt, his hair still damp from the shower. David did not look up from the laptop. "It's bad." "Show me." David turned the screen around. Michael looked at the numbers without expression. He had built a career on knowing the difference between numbers that mattered and numbers that only looked like they mattered, and these were the first kind. "What did the board say?" "Margaret called at 4:45. She's flying in on the first plane out of Teterboro. 3 other directors are already in the air. They want a strategy meeting at 8. They want you in it." "And what is the strategy they want?" David closed the laptop very slowly. He was a careful man. He had been Michael's first hire 11 years earlier, when Carter Hospitality had been a 2-person operation, working out of a converted accountant's office in Stamford, and he had stayed careful all the way through the company's 700% growth, and through Elena's diagnosis, and through the long, quiet year after her funeral, when Michael had not made a single decision that did not have to be made. David had earned the right to tell him the truth. "Sir, there are 3 options on the table, and only one of them has the board's pre-approval. May I lay them out?" "Lay them out." David lifted one finger. "Option A. We do not respond publicly. We retain crisis communications. We file a takedown request on the original video, citing the minor child we offer Brooks, a quiet severance package contingent on a non-disclosure agreement. And we pay every person in that lobby last night, a settlement large enough that nobody talks. Estimated total exposure $8 to $12 million. The story dies inside 72 hours. The brand does not move." A second finger. Option B. We sever Brooks publicly but quietly. A neutral press statement citing internal review. We do not address the broader pattern. We do not acknowledge the other properties. We bring in a new general manager from the Boston market within 10 days. Estimated exposure 25 to 35 million. The story softens within 2 weeks. The brand takes a small, permanent dent. A third finger. Option C. You hold a press conference at this property today. You disclose the full 18-month complaint history. You name the training pipeline. You announce a system-wide audit and a restructuring of guest standards across all 47 properties. Estimated exposure 80 to 120 million in the first year alone. The stock takes a 15 to 20% hit on Monday's open. The board does not approve option C, Michael. Stakeholders will revolt. You just bought this chain. We have not even closed the integration of the loyalty program. This is not the time. Michael stood at the window and looked out over Michigan Avenue. The street below was wet and bright, and full of the slow Saturday traffic of a city waking up. "David." "Sir?" "Do you remember the conversation we had in the car after my mother's funeral?" David did not answer immediately. He did remember. They had driven from the cemetery in Detroit back to the airport in silence, and somewhere on I-94, Michael had said, without looking at him, "I am going to spend the rest of my working life making sure that the kind of place that broke my mother does not get to keep breaking people's mothers." David had nodded and said nothing because there had been nothing to say. "I remember. Set up the press conference. Lobby. 11 a.m. option C." The room was quiet for a long count of 3. "Yes, sir." He picked up his phone and started making calls. By 7 o'clock, the formal paperwork was through. Allison Brooks received the call from Human Resources at her home in Lincoln Park while she was still in yesterday's clothes. She was told that her employment with Crown Meridian Hotels and Resorts had been terminated effective immediately, that her badge and access would be deactivated at the end of the call, and that as a final professional courtesy, and only because she had requested it, Mr. Carter had agreed to give her a single private meeting later that morning, in a small office on the second floor of the property before the press conference began. She accepted. She showered. She did not put the uniform back on. By 10:58, the lobby of the Crown Meridian Chicago looked nothing like the lobby it had been 12 hours earlier. The orchid arrangement had been pulled. The seating around the fireplace had been cleared. A simple wooden lectern had been set down in the middle of the marble floor, but Michael had asked when he came down at 10:45 for it to be removed. He did not want anything between him and the room. He stood in the exact place where Brent from security had told him to step outside. The press were 3 rows deep against the windows. Local affiliates, the national networks, 2 pool cameras from the wire services, a knot of bloggers with phones held up at arm's length. The Crown Meridian staff stood along the back wall in their uniforms. Caleb Rivera was among them in a suit. Michael had not seen him in the night before, his hands clasped in front of him. Eleanor Whitmore had returned without her husband and stood near the bar where she had been the night before watching. Allison Brooks was not in the room. Michael did not read from notes. My name is Michael Carter. I am the founder and chairman of Carter Hospitality Group. As of April 11th of this year, my company is the owner of every Crown Meridian property in the United States, including this one. He let that settle. He went on. Last night at approximately 9:43 p.m., I walked into this lobby with my 8-year-old daughter. We had been flying for most of the day. We were tired. My daughter had spilled juice on her sweater on the plane. I was carrying a duffel bag I have owned since graduate school. I gave the name on my reservation to the general manager of this property, and she did not check her computer. She told me I had the wrong hotel. When I declined to leave, she called security. My daughter and I were walked out of this building in front of a lobby full of guests into the street. A reporter near the front lifted a hand. Michael did not stop. I want to be very clear about something. What happened to me and my daughter last night was not a misunderstanding. It was the working out of a policy. That policy has a name inside this company. It is called guest profile alignment. It has been taught formally and informally at this property, and at a number of other Crown Meridian properties for at least the last 14 years. It was taught to the manager on duty last night by a man named Robert Hadley, who retired from this property 3 years ago. It has been taught to other managers at our locations in Boston, Denver, and elsewhere by Mr. Hadley and by his peers. A small murmur went through the room. As of 7 o'clock this morning, the employment of Allison Brooks at this company has been terminated. As of 8 o'clock this morning, the employment of 3 other property managers trained under the same protocol has also been terminated pending the outcome of a full external audit of all 47 of our United States properties, which begins on Monday. He took a breath. He did not look at his notes because he did not have any. That is not the part of this announcement I came down here to make. I came down here to make this part. The room got quieter. Effective today. Carter Hospitality is establishing a $50 million fund for the retraining of every front-of-house and management employee in this chain. 8,400 people. The new training protocol, which will be developed in partnership with 3 civil rights organizations, whose names will be released this afternoon, will be called the Crown Standards Reset. It will eliminate in writing and in practice any guest evaluation criteria based on appearance attire, perceived income, race, or family composition. It will establish a confidential anonymous reporting channel for any employee at any level who is asked by a superior to misrepresent a guest interaction. And it will introduce, for the first time in this chain's 80-year history, a formal recognition and bonus structure for staff who protect the dignity of a guest under pressure. He looked very briefly toward the back wall. The first person recognized under that structure will be Mr. Caleb Rivera, who is here this morning. Mr. Rivera was the front desk associate, who last night after I had been walked out of this building, ran my name through his own system, on his own initiative located the truth, and walked back outside to find me. Mr. Rivera will be serving as the acting general manager of this property, effective immediately, and will be considered for the permanent role at the conclusion of the audit. Caleb did not move. His jaw worked once the way it had worked the night before, and he kept his hands clasped and his eyes forward. Michael lifted his face to the cameras. I want to address one more person. I want to address every guest in any Crown Meridian over the past 14 years who was turned away at a front desk for a reason that did not have to do with their reservation. We have set up an email address. It is makeitright@crownmeridian.com. We will read every message. We will not make you sign anything. We will not require you to release us. We will simply listen, and where there is something we can repair, we will repair it. He stopped. The last sentence he said into the cameras, he said quietly. The room had to lean in for it. Last night I let my 8-year-old daughter stand outside in the cold to make a point. That was wrong of me. Sophie, if you ever watch this when you are older, I am sorry. You taught me more last night than any business school I have ever sat in. I love you. I will do better. He stepped back. He did not take questions. He walked the length of the marble floor, past the fireplace, past Eleanor Whitmore at the bar, past the back wall of staff in their uniforms, and into the corridor that led to the service elevators. He took those up. In a small office on the second floor, Allison Brooks was waiting. She was in a blouse and slacks, and her hair was pulled back, and her badge sat on the desk in front of her in a small plastic sleeve deactivated 4 hours earlier. She had been escorted up by Human Resources 20 minutes before to complete the offboarding paperwork, and had requested, as her one professional courtesy, the chance to say a single thing to the owner of the company before she signed the last form and left the building for the last time. Michael shut the door behind him. He did not sit down. He did not extend a hand. You wanted to say something. For a long moment, she did not. I thought I was doing my job right. It was he understood the truest thing she could have said. She was not asking for forgiveness. She was reporting almost clinically the conclusion of a 5-year experiment in being told what her job was and doing it. She had not woken up in the morning intending cruelty. She had woken up intending fitness for a brand. The cruelty had been a byproduct so quiet that until last night, she had not been able to hear it over the sound of her own competence. I know, Michael said. He let the sentence sit between them. That is the problem, Allison. The system told you that was the job. The system was wrong. We are changing the system. I'm not going to pretend that makes what you did to my daughter forgivable. I'm not going to pretend it makes what you did to 23 other families forgivable either. But I want you to leave this building understanding that the worst thing I can do to you today is not fire you. It is to let you walk out of here knowing that you spent 5 years being very good at a job that should not have existed. Tonsua, she looked at the badge on the desk. She did not pick it up. She did not cry. She did not argue. She stood very slowly and walked past him, and she left the office and she left the building, and Michael did not watch her go. 6 weeks later, on a Friday night that was also by some coincidence, the universe had not bothered to coordinate wet and cold, Michael and Sophie walked back through the revolving door of the Crown Meridian Chicago. It was not a test this time. It was a weekend. Sophie had asked 2 days earlier at breakfast if maybe they could see Mr. Rivera again before her dance recital on Sunday. She had a new stuffed rabbit under her arm, a gift from David Lane's daughter, who was 7 and had heard the story, and the old one, the one her mother had bought at the hospital gift shop, was at home on a shelf in her bedroom where it would stay for the rest of her life. Caleb Rivera was at the front desk in a suit that fit him better than the one from the press conference. He came around the desk when he saw them, and he shook Michael's hand and crouched down to shake Sophie's, and a bellhop Michael did not recognize stepped up with an umbrella and offered to take the small overnight bag from his shoulder. The lobby around them was full of the ordinary sound of a hotel doing its job. At the revolving door behind them, another family came through. A father in a windbreaker. 2 small children in raincoats, a modest piece of wheeled luggage with a sticker on the side from a children's museum in St. Louis. The father looked tired. The smaller of the 2 children was holding on to the hem of his jacket, the way Sophie had once held on to Michael's. A young woman in a Crown Meridian blazer crossed the marble toward them, with an umbrella already opening, and a smile already on her face. "Welcome to the Crown Meridian," she said. "May I take that bag for you? And what is the name on the reservation?" The father gave her a name Michael did not catch. She typed it in, and she found it, and she smiled at the smaller child and asked her how old she was. And the small child, who was maybe 6, held up 6 fingers very seriously, and the young woman said, just as seriously, that 6 was an excellent age. Sophie watched. She tugged gently on her father's hand. "Daddy," she said, "do you think they finally understand now?" Michael looked at the family at the desk. He looked at the bellhop with the umbrella. He looked at Caleb Rivera standing very straight at the front of his lobby. He thought about his mother in the parking lot of the Belford Grand in 1991, and he thought about Elena, who had not lived to see any of this, and who would have liked Caleb very much. He smiled just a little. "I think they're finally learning, baby." He took his daughter's hand, and the 2 of them walked across the marble toward the elevators, and outside the weather kept falling, and inside under the warm lights, somebody else's child was being treated like a person.